i srećan i uzbuđen što u ovom domu narodnog prosvećivanja možemo da pozdravimo odista, kada je u islamologiji reč, verovatno jednog od najuglednijih i najuticajnijih islamologa današnjice. To je retka prilika, srećom, u ovoj oblasti koja za nas uopšte nije neutralna, mi tu priliku sada imamo. Dolazak profesora Esposita u našu sredinu je i po tome srećan što on ne dolazi ovamo nepoznat. Kao što je kolega Bataković upravo rekao, dve značajne knjige profesora Esposita su prevedene kod nas. Zahvaljujući sluhu i dobroj uređivačkoj politici ugledne izdavačke kuće Prosveta, 1994. godine prevedena je problemska knjiga, jedna od najvažnijih problemskih knjiga profesora Esposita, Islamska pretnja, mit ili stvarnost. A ne tako davno, ugledna izdavačka kuća Clio objavila je kapitalno delo profesora Esposita i saradnika, Oksfordska istorija islama. Dakle, u vreme kada smo već pomalo navikli da nam dobitnici Nobelovih nagrada za književnost budu potpuno nepoznati, što naravno više govori o nama nego o njima, mi danas ovde dočekujemo naučnika koji u ovoj sredini, bar za one koji se za teme kojima se on bavi zanimaju, poznat. Tako da nije potrebno mnogo ga predstavljati i ja neću svakako oduzimati mnogo vremena. Javio, na primer, knjigu Pravi put, naravno odnosi se na islam, koja je jedno predstavljanje islama onako kako ga vide muslimani, ali za zapadnog čitaoca. Knjiga je doživela više izdanja, treće je, mislim, bilo 1998. godine. Tu je zatim knjiga koja je rađena u koautorstvu Islam i demokratija, a verovatno da nema u vezi sa islamom teme o kojoj se više raspravljalo od odnosa između islama i demokratije, odnosno mogućnosti uspostavljanja islamske demokratije, odnosno demokratije u islamu, što nije sasvim ista stvar. Zatim dolazi knjiga, srećom i kod nas prevedena, Islamska pretnja, mit ili stvarnost, koja je, ponavljam, sigurno ključna za razumevanje ukupnog pristupa fenomenu islama koji je karakterističan za profesora Esposita, a mogu reći i za njegovu školu, o čemu bih kasnije nešto više govorio. Zatim, Muslimani i politika u islamu, također veoma zapažena knjiga, odnos prema fenomenu političkog u islamu, također tema o kojoj se veoma mnogo razgovara, ne uvek sa dovoljno poznavanja. I najzad, ali naravno ne na poslednjem mestu, pogotovo s obzirom na aktualnost, tu je i knjiga Nesveti rat, Unholy War. Znači, terorizam u ime islama, objavljena 2002. godine, jasno vam je po naslovu čemu ova knjiga nastoji da odgovori. Kojem velikom izazovu koji je potresao svet i koji je doneo u mnogo čemu i preispitivanje ukupnog odnosa na zapadu prema islamu. Dakle, to je jedna linija rada profesora Esposita, istraživačka, stvaralačka, tragalačka, ona koja je uvek u neposrednom dijalogu sa najaktualnijim pitanjima trenutka. S druge strane, i to je dragoceno, profesor Esposito ne zanemaruje sintetički pristup fenomenima kojima se bavi. On je sa saradnicima, a velika mu je zasluga što je stvorio tim ljudi sa kojima sarađuje, koji nije formalno povezan, ali koji je usvojio sličan pogled na islam i radi s njim, mogu reći za posljednjih 10 godina uradio posao koji bi trebalo da uradi jedan institut ili recimo više instituta. On je tako, osjetivši potrebu da se i savremeni islam upozna na način na koji je poznat klasični islam, zajedno sa saradnicima objavio 4-tomnu enciklopediju modernog islama, kapitalno delo, koji je u svakom slučaju najbolji dodatak i suplement poznatoj enciklopediji islama, koja je za svakoga orijentalistu i islamistu sredstvo za rad od koga boljega nema. Zatim tu je ova oksfordska istorija islama, sintetički pregled, ja ne bih rekao što sam napisao i pogovor u knjizi, toliko istorije islama koliko ukupne islamske civilizacije u njenom istorijskom kretanju. Jer tu je pitanje shvatanja istorije kao jednog događajnog sleda, svakako u drugom planu, to je celokupna islamska civilizacija u svom istorijskom kretanju. I vrlo nedavno, također kapitalni oksfordski rečnik islama. Znači, čitava jedna biblioteka dela koja se u ovom trenutku mogu smatrati fundamentalno. Tu je do izražaja došla moć profesora Esposita da ubedi krug veoma kompetentnih islamologa u ispravnost onoga pristupa koji je svojstven njegovom radu u oblasti islamologije. On ima izvanredne sposobnosti za timski rad i upravo zato je uspeo da stvori školu. Ja mislim da mi možemo danas reći, bez preterivanja, da smo večeras u prisustvu čoveka koji je u savremenoj islamologiji stvorio školu. To nije jedina škola. To nije škola sa kojom će svako biti saglasan, ali to je škola koja ima ideju, škola koja ima metod i škola koja ima cilj. Taj cilj jeste naučna istina, ali ne naučna istina koja je sama sebi svrha. To je naučna istina koja treba da posluži sporazumevanju među ljudima i smanjivanju jaza među njima, a pre svega uklanjanju predubeđenja i neznanja iz međuljudskih odnosa, neznanja jednih od drugima. Retko je, i mislim da je izuzetna privilegija, imati u svojoj sredini čoveka koji je tvorac škole u jednoj oblasti ljudskog delovanja i razmišljanja. A veoma je zanimljivo i to da je profesor Esposito, prema sopstvenom kazivanju, uopšte u početku svoje naučne karijere nije imao nameru da se bavi islamom. On je uopšte imao zanimljiv život. Uvek ističe da je imao dva života. Da je imao jedan život pre početka ovoga života sa kojim se mi susrećemo i ovoga profesora Esposita sa kojim se mi susrećemo, ali jedan život koji je ostavio dubok trag u njemu, a to je njegova odanost veri, katoličkoj veri, i to u najčistijem monaškom vidu. On je bio član jednog verskog bratstva. Da bi kasnije to napustio, što uvek ističe, oženio se i počeo svetovni život u punom smislu te reči, ali sa jednim sasvim posebnim iskustvom. Istraživao je katoličku teologiju, istraživao je budizam, istraživao je hinduizam, bio je sklon komparativnom sagledavanju religija, međutim, nekako mu je islam izmicao. I to nije slučajno. On je sam problematizovao tu činjenicu gubljenja islama iz vidokruga naučne pažnje. U jednom trenutku, ako se ne varam, Bernard Phillips, u to vreme šef katedre na kojoj je on bio, mu je sugerisao zašto ne bi počeo da se malo bavi islamom i da se to zainteresuje. On nije imao naročiti interes, ali sticajem okolnosti, a možda i slučaja, ukoliko slučaja u ljudskim stvarima uopšte ima, on je negde 67. godine počeo da se zanima za islam, ali sa jednim već ozbiljnim iskustvom, sa već stvorenim idejama, sa zrelošću, intelektualnom, emocionalnom i ukupno duhovnom. I tada je pred njim pukao horizont avramovskog korena, avramovski horizont triju velikih monoterističkih religija, islama, judaizma i hrišćanstva. Shvatio je koliko tu ima bliskosti koje nismo svesni i počeo je temeljno da proučava islam upravo da bi ga približio onima koji njemu govore uopšteno, ne poznajući ga dovoljno, a nemaju bliže rođake kada je bar vera monoteistička u pitanju. Njegova osnovna ideja od početka bila, i on joj služi do danas, da činjenicama o islamu se bori protiv predubeđenja o islamu. Da se bori znanjem protiv neznanja ili poluznanja, koja mogu biti veoma opasna i štetna. On je među ljudima koji su pokazali da islam, kada kažemo islam, da to nisu samo Arapi, Turci ili oni muslimani koji su nama najbliži, zavisnosti od toga gde živimo. Jer naravno kad neko kaže islam u centralnoj Aziji ili kad neko kaže na Dalekom istoku ili u Africi, ne misli uvek na Arape i Turke, već na muslimane koje ima u sopstvenom iskustvu. On je dakle otvorio područje proučavanja na ono što se nekada zvalo periferni islam, za razliku od centralnog islamskog sveta. On je uronio u azijski islam, u dalekoazijski islam, dalekoistočni islam, s obzirom na to da je od ranije imao vokaciju i afinitet da proučava budizam, hinduizam i druge dalekoistočne religijske sisteme. On je pokazao da su muslimani u Maleziji, u Indoneziji, u drugim zemljama muslimani, ali drugačiji od muslimana na koje smo mi navikli. On je dakle pokušao, i dalje to nastavlja da čini, veoma uspešno, da islamski svet pokazuje u jedinstvu njegovih različitosti, ne kao monolitnu celinu, kakva realno ne postoji na civilizacijskom nivou, s tim što je kod njega akcenat iz određenih, mogao bih čak reći, pedagoških razloga ili andragoških razloga na različitostima, jer smatra da je uopštavanje, svako uopštavanje po definiciji pogrešno, iako je ponekad neophodno i nužno, i on znači ukazuje na tu raznolikost lica islama u svetu, ne ističući u prvi plan ono što mu je jedinstveno, jer koliko ja razumem smatra da to što je jedinstveno se i previše ponekad ističe, iz toga izvode zaključci koji možda i nisu oni pravi, a kada je život islamskih društava u pitanju, život onih koji sa tim društvima dolaze u kontakt. Tu naravno postoje i neslaganja u islamološkim krugovima, postoje polemike, nije ovaj metod i ovakav pristup profesora Esposita prihvaćen od svih njegovih kolega, postoje naravno i drugačija mišljenja, ali ko može više doprinuti nauci od onoga ko postavlja pitanja koje izazivaju naučnu diskusiju pod uslovom da se svakome dozvoli da kaže ono što misli. Na kraju, postoji nešto zbog čega mislim da je boravak profesora Esposita danas ovde, a ovih dana u Zagrebu, Sarajevu i Tuzli posebno dragocen, a to što je on i po sopstvenom kazivanju možda ponajmanje prostora u svom dosadašnjem islamološkom radu posvetio upravo prostoru jugoistočne Evrope i islamu u Evropi. I kada je dolazio ovamo, iskazao veliku radoznalost da dođe ne samo da poučava, već i da uči o realnosti islamskih društava jugoistočnog Balkana i jugoistočne Evrope i znači onoj realnosti islama koja postoji na tom delu evropskog kontinenta. I mislim da iz ovog njegovog susreta sa nama ovde, a prethodnih dana u Sarajevu, Tuzli i Zagrebu, mogu proizaći i veoma zanimljivi teorijski uvidi i obogaćenje budućih radova profesora Esposita, što bi, mislim, bio najmanje oduženje onome i onim dragocenim vrednostima koje on nama podario i čime on nas obogatio. On je inače čovek koji ne izbegava javni nastup, koji veoma mnogo putuje, koji je često na televizijama Amerike i drugih zemalja, koji daje mnogo intervjua, koji smatra da nauka ne sme da se zatvori u kulu od slonovače i zahvaljujući tom jednom otvorenom pristupu i mi imamo zadovoljstvo da ga večeras pozdravimo u svojoj sredini. Ja vam zahvaljujem što ste došli i siguran sam da niste pogrešili.
In particular, like to acknowledge the very generous introduction that was given. If I were humble, I would say it's not true, but since I'm not humble, I would like to especially thank my colleague. I learned more about myself than I think I even realized, so it was really quite wonderful. I always like to tell people, especially after an introduction like that I am the least intelligent of the three boys in my family, and that is accurate. That is not humility speaking. A reference was made to my being married. That's a central part of my life. I've been married 38 years, and so that's my first life. although I do have that previous life, which has had an influence on me. Let me try to tell you just very briefly in 3 sentences or 4 who I am, because I think it's relevant to what I'm going to say. We've heard a good deal of who I am. For me, the formative influences on my life are the fact that I am Italian-American, that I did spend some 10 years on and off with the Capuchin Franciscan Fathers, my study of Islam, but also in my life and as director of the center, my interaction with Orthodox Christianity. When I was with the Capuchin Franciscan Fathers, every year we would have a liturgy in what at that time we referred to as the Eastern Rite. And although I couldn't understand it, I was in the choir and we would memorize the Greek for the liturgy. The beauty of that liturgy helped to engender an interest in general in Orthodoxy, and in my center we in fact have some courses, and over the years we have hosted the first, I think, major Muslim Orthodox Christian dialogue in the United States at Georgetown at a time when the Patriarch Bartholomeos came to Georgetown, visited us from Istanbul to receive an honorary degree. Now let me get to the heart of my comments. In the 21st century and post 9/11, it's more important than ever before to realize that Islam and Christianity are indeed the 2 largest religions in the world, that Muslims and Christians comprise more than half of the world's population, and that they engage each other globally, not just in one area. For example, primarily Judaism engages Christianity and Islam in Israel, and maybe a little in the United States, but politically in Israel. Islam and Christianity, it's in many parts of the world, including here. The second phenomenon, or reality, is that Islam and Christianity are the 2 fastest growing religions, particularly in Africa and Asia. The third is that unlike only 30 years ago, when Islam was invisible in the West, in 30 years it has become the 2nd largest religion in Europe and the 3rd largest religion in America. These are phenomenal changes. When we look at Islam and Christianity, what we see is something also very interesting. Both religious traditions today have a majority that is mainstream. Both have suffered from extremists, whether they are Muslim or Christian extremists in the United States, and we have them there, or in other parts of the world, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and at times in the Balkans itself. This is part of our phenomenon. We can look, as I said, to the United States, to Lebanon, to the Balkans, to Egypt. There are many examples. What can we say that is important and that we need to think about in terms of the 21st century? Because it's very interesting. Many of us who are professors teach subjects that nobody's interested in. I mean, the broad popular. We may do our specialties, but by and large we do our specialties, we do some publishing, but it's not as if broad audiences want to hear us. When I began to study Islam, there was very little interest. Most of my friends thought I would never get a job, and in general they were accurate. When I finished in 1974, there were maybe 2 positions in the United States that I could compete for. And the position that I obtained was actually to teach Hinduism and Buddhism, not Islam. From 1974 to 79, I was invisible. I was in my office, I taught my courses, but my phone never rang, as I like to say. And if I sent out projects to publish books to publishers in the United States, And indeed, if Clio were in existence then and I sent them, they would probably not have answered me. Or, as a few did, they said, good idea, but there's no market. Nobody's going to buy it. All of that changed incredibly in 1978-79. I'm going to say something that I say in the United States, and it can be misunderstood. But I'm at an age where I don't have to care about that. But I want you to listen and try to understand what I'm saying. Having been invisible from 74 to 79, having had few people interested in publishing my stuff, certainly very few government officials or the media interested, living in a country in which Islam was relatively invisible and most people knew very little about it, America in many ways discovered Islam with the Iranian Revolution. It was the Iranian Revolution and the fear in the 1980s that Iran would export that revolution that made it a central defining reality. Suddenly knowing about Islam in the Muslim world became important for political reasons, for economic reasons, not just for cultural reasons. And so I like to say that I owe my job and my Lexus to the Ayatollah Khomeini. But again, this has to be understood. But part of what is true here is something about human reality. If we know nothing about someone, an ethnic group or a religious group, we tend to generalize off the one or two people we meet. If I'm the only Italian that somebody meets, they think all Italians speak with their hands. All Italians get emotional. My father is just the opposite. You would think he was born in Northern Europe rather than in Southern Europe. Very calm, very cool, but we generalize about that. When I grew up as an Italian minority in America, and even for years later, many people thought that Italians were people who were good laborers, who worked with cement, building roads, or put people in cement. And they associated us with mafia. I remember years later living in a kind of upscale suburban neighborhood and going to a dinner party, and after it saying to my wife, these people are talking about Italians. I'm Italian. Look at the way they talk. She said, you're not Italian to them. You have a PhD. But they couldn't make that connection. And so we do that, and we do the same thing about other people's religions. You know, if we meet somebody and they follow a religion that we don't know, or if we see a headline event about a certain religion that we know nothing about, we will generalize. So for Americans who every day put on their television during the Iranian Revolution and saw people in the streets yelling, "Death to America," Americans aren't stupid. If they say "Death to America," they must mean it. But of course, for many, they generalize that that must be what all Muslims are about. Or even the sense, because if CNN were here today and you all jumped up and started yelling, "Death to Esposito, death to Esposito," most people in America would think that everybody in Serbia was against me. You know, that I was known throughout the country because CNN is covering me. It must mean that it goes beyond the numbers in this room. Now, what that meant was that from the Iranian Revolution to the hijackings in Lebanon, Americans were engaging 1.2 billion Muslims, making judgments about them through the actions of a significant but a minority of extremists. That's the reality. I mean, that's the way people make those judgments. And people make those same judgments that they generalize about Serbs or Croats or Bosniaks. If they don't know anything about them, they deal with the 2 or 3. And we know that. If you're a Serb and you go to America and you run into somebody who starts saying some very negative things and says, "I know people from your region," your reaction might be to say, "Now, who do you know from my region? Were they Serbs? Or did you have dinner with 2 or 3 people from another ethnic group in my region who gave you their perspective on what happened?" And this is part of what we grapple with. Now, the danger of this is not only the dangers that we've seen in Lebanon and in the Balkans recently, but in the 21st century, the danger exists because we live in a globalized world. It's not just that this region is multi-religious and multi-ethnic. With globalization that interconnects us politically, economically, communications, technology, the extent to which religion is an important factor and often connects with ethnicity and nationalism is not only a concern here, it's a global concern. We learned in 9/11 the fact that a small group of extremist Arabs, many of whom from Saudi Arabia, didn't like America, did not just affect Americans living in Saudi Arabia, it could affect Americans in New York and in Washington. And in fact, that's the lesson we wanted to drive home. And it affected all of us. Why? 9/11 affected our economies, and if the economies of America and Western Europe are hit, the economies of the world will be affected. It affected us politically, and it affected many, since we're talking about global terrorism, if we talk about Al-Qaeda, in terms of a fear, feeling under siege. Look at how much more now, getting more difficult it is to get visas. The process. Look at how many more countries want visas. Look at how people say get to the airport early because it takes longer to get through security. I mean, all of those things affect us. And so this makes, therefore, understanding not only religions or other people's religions, but the connection of religion to politics, not simply an intellectual enterprise. When I began to go to professional meetings in the 70s, nobody showed up. 6 people would come, and as a junior professor, I always feared that the administration of my university would hear about this because they'd say, then why do we have them if only 6 people want to hear them? If you spoke publicly, you didn't know whether or not you would get an audience. Today, we can talk to audiences small and enormous. I have spoken, the largest audience I've spoken to is 250 to 300,000 people. I call myself the Mick Jagger of Islamic studies. It also shows you my age. But years ago, I'd be lucky if I had 6 or 10 people. So we now realize that there are a variety of reasons, practical reasons, not just intellectual reasons or theoretical reasons. What about this world in which we find ourselves? We see today, in recent years, a global resurgence of religion. You look at studies of Christianity, whether mainstream or conservative, whether Orthodox, Catholic, whatever, and we see often stories about how more people are becoming more religiously observant. More people are going to church and synagogue, etc. It may not be happening in Britain and France, but it's happening in a lot of other areas of the world, including America. So, more people do go to their mosque, to their synagogue, to their churches than before. But we also see in recent decades the reassertion of the connection of religion to nationalism, of the connection of religion to ethnicity. And we see that in conflicts again, not just Lebanon and the Balkans, but in India, or in Indonesia, or in Egypt. So we see that reality. Now, what about that reality? We see that there are extremist individuals and groups who engage in violence and terror, and this cuts across religion. Look at the conflicts between Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims in India. Okay. But we also see that there are mainstream expressions of religion, not just in personal life, but that there are many across the world who somehow want to see their religion as part of not just their personal identity, but their social identity, and for some, even their political identity. This can be a cause of strength, but it can also be a cause of conflict and warfare, again, as we have seen. In the Muslim world, this has meant that in the 1980s, many saw political Islam as simply revolutionary Islam, that Iran was going to export its revolution. In the 1990s, we begin to see not just extremist movements, underground, engaging in violence and terror, but we see social and political movements inside mainstream society. When authoritarian regimes hold elections, Islamic candidates and parties emerge as the leading opposition. And in Algeria, they swept parliamentary elections, and the fear was that they would come to power. So what did the military do? In the name of saving democracy, it seized power. It's a very interesting process. We save democracy by seizing power and impose our form of government, even after people have elected a party, not just once, but several times. Creates very interesting issues. But what was the reaction in many parts of the world, and very much in the West, when it saw mainstream participation, socially and political? In fact, it saw that as a threat also. In many ways, it reflected the very authoritarian regimes in the region who don't want to see any opposition. Why? Because many Western governments that are secular see any role of religion in politics, or fear that any role of religion in politics will lead to violence and extremism. They look at the example of Lebanon. They look at a variety of examples. But also in the West, we begin to see a concern that Islam, now present and growing in Europe and in America, is a population threat, a demographic threat. In many ways, they resurrect the fears of past history. And we all have that baggage of past history. Muslims remember the Crusades and the Inquisition, and many Orthodox Christians and many other non-Orthodox Christians have their memories of the past. And these then come to bear on our reactions. What are the issues, though, post 9/11? And I want to keep this brief so that we can have a question and answer period, or so that we could just end early and all go off to drink and have dinner, those of us who drink. Post 9/11, our real concern has to be, are we going in our regions, but also globally, are we going to see more clashes, or are we going to figure out a way for greater coexistence? But to do this, we need to face very honestly and in a very straightforward way the issues that exist. The first is the connection of religion to ethnicity or religion to nationalism. What are the dangers? What are the opportunities? In speaking in Zagreb, in speaking in Tuzla, in speaking in Sarajevo, I had those who worried about the fact that if religion were to be linked formally to nationalism, it would make for an exclusive situation in which a multi-religious and a multi-ethnic society would be that much more difficult. Yet these were people who certainly wanted to affirm both their religious and ethnic identity, the challenge how to do it. I had one person say, we need to think of ways of defining a more secular structure within which religion and ethnicity can function. But these are debates that will need to be engaged in societies. Because, for example, to simply advocate a secular society, there are many forms of secular society. America, Canada, Western Europe, there are many forms. In some forms, there's complete separation of religion and state. But in Canada and many European countries, while it is a secular society, the state often supports religion. Not just the state religion, but the major religions. These are issues that need to be addressed. The second is the need to address honestly something that often happens. In the Muslim world, I often say to my Muslim friends, the more some people talk about Islamization of society and politics, the more it's accompanied by another process, what I call Kafirization, and I'll explain what that means. For some, Islamization means making society more Islamic. But at the same time, some then accuse anybody who differ with them whether it's other religions or even people in their own religion, of being kuffar, of being unbelievers. We also see this among some Christians. When they advocate a more Christian society, they tend to really say Christians like me. And so they reject not only other religions, but even other Christians whose interpretation differs from theirs. And so religion can be a source of unity, but also disunity. And we see these conflicts occurring again in many parts of the world. We certainly see it in the Balkans. It's not just a question of Christian and Muslim, it can be a question of Christian and Christian. Same thing in Lebanon. Another thing we need to distinguish between is conflicts that are primarily political and economically motivated, but which appeal to religion. In other words, some conflicts are primarily religious, where people fight each other primarily for religious reasons. In other cases, you have political leaders who are able to get some religious leaders to legitimate a primarily political and economic conflict in the name of religion. And then that is used to mobilize more people. We need to make these kinds of distinctions and be aware of them. Because to the extent that that happens, then religion is part of the problem. And to the extent that that's the case, in order to have a solution, one needs to address not only the political and economic dimension, but the religious dimension. What do I mean by that? And here I'll try to bring this to some kind of conclusion. In the 21st century, at a time when we have seen religiously legitimated conflicts, where we have seen Christians and Muslims in conflict, but also Christians, Muslims, and Hindus and Jews in conflict, then the issue of religious pluralism becomes important, and the issue of religious tolerance becomes important. But we need to have a more enlightened and a more modern notion of pluralism and tolerance. In the old days, not that long ago, certainly when I was growing up, religious tolerance meant, I accept your existence. I don't persecute you or kill you. But it didn't necessarily mean that I seek to know or understand who you are, what your religion is about. It often meant that I could look down upon other people without knowing much about them. It often meant that I could be dismissive of them. It often meant that I might work with them, but it didn't mean that I wanted to socialize with them. Let me give you a concrete example. When I was a young man, many of us lived in neighborhoods that were religiously identified, Jewish, Catholic, or ethnically identified, Italian, Irish. Of course, everybody would want to live in an Italian neighborhood, but only a few select people like myself could as a child. But we also had a certain attitude. I wanted to be a Boy Scout. The Boy Scouts met in a Protestant church, in the basement of the church. As a Catholic, I could not go to a Protestant church. I could not go to a wedding without getting special permission, attend somebody's wedding or a funeral. But we even debated whether I could go and meet in the basement of the church, even though the head of the Boy Scouts was an Italian and a Roman Catholic. It was still a Protestant church. And so I grew up knowing very little about Protestant faith or Jewish faith, even though I might run across people who were Protestant or Jewish. In today's world, it becomes important that we educate the next generation. In our universities, in our schools, but also in our seminaries, the next generation of religious leaders, so that they know not only their own faith and ethnic heritage, but they know the faith and ethnic heritage of others in their society and others in the world. It is only then that they can be effective citizens, because in our globalized society, we increasingly need to understand others not only as fellow believers, but as fellow citizens and neighbors. Not only citizens regionally, but global citizens. That is a very difficult demand. To be honest, most of the older generation of our teachers, our university professors, our parents, and our religious leaders have not been educated that way. That becomes the challenge in the future. Unless we do that, as we look at regional or global conflicts, as we have to make decisions, not only as citizens locally, but citizens internationally, we will not have the information or the perspective. We will be prone more towards clash than towards coexistence. Thank you.
Sharing your views with us. Let me just at the end